The day the power goes out, panic won't come from the dark. It'll come from the kitchen. Fridges will warm, freezers will melt, shelves will empty faster than anyone expects. But in 1940s wartime Europe, blackout was normal. No modern storage, no reliable electricity, no cold chain. Yet somehow, food endured. Families didn't wait for trucks. They preserved meals that outlasted winters, sieges, and entire regimes, using salt, ash, wax, and heat, not as traditions, but as necessity. These foods weren't survival trends. They were infrastructure. Hard, bland, calorie-dense, and brutally effective, stored in basements, hidden under beds, eaten cold, rehydrated, or scraped from tins long past any modern expiration date. Each one carried a lesson. When the system breaks, the food that lasts is the food history already proved. And if that day comes again, only those who remembered will eat. Would you recognize any of them on your shelf today? Subscribe and reclaim the forgotten menu of survival. Number 1. Hardtack biscuits. When bread vanished from bakery shelves, civilians reached for something older and far tougher. Hardtack wasn't born in WWII. It was a relic from centuries of naval warfare, but the war brought it back into pantries, bunkers, and bomb shelters across Europe. Made with just flour, salt, and water, these biscuits were mixed, rolled flat, cut into bricks, and baked at low heat, often twice, until all moisture was gone. The result was a food that could last years without spoiling. No yeast, no fat, no fragility. Stored in sealed tins, metal boxes, or wrapped tightly in cloth, hardtack resisted rot, mold, and pests. It became the fallback when fresh bread turned to crumbs or when flour rations made baking impossible. Civilians softened it by soaking in broth or tea. Some crushed it into powder and mixed it with milk or margarine to form makeshift dough. Others simply endured the dense chew, biting slowly while listening for air raid sirens above. But its real strength wasn't in taste, it was in time. Hardtack could survive years in storage, through humidity, heat waves, and long winters without losing its calorie value. It didn't rely on refrigeration, preservatives, or special containers. It relied on simplicity and dryness. Two things any household could control. Still, it had limits. Hardtack was nutritionally basic. It provided bulk, not balance. Too much of it, and the body would lack vitamins and fiber. But in times of crisis, it filled the gap between hunger and nothing. Wartime families often made it at home, using rationed flour with meticulous care. They cut it into uniform blocks, scored it with fork holes, and dried it slowly over stoves, saving every last ounce. In cities under siege, where supplies vanished and bakeries closed, hardtack remained. It didn't spoil, it didn't crumble, and it didn't run out, unless you forgot how to make it. Today, we scroll past recipes labeled survival food, full of exotic ingredients and modern tools, but none match the sheer resilience of a biscuit made from 3 forgotten things: heat, patience, and planning. Would you bake one before the next outage, or will you wait until the bread is gone? Subscribe and start with what history already proved. Number 2. Salt-preserved pork. When meat vanished from butcher shops and iceboxes stood empty, civilians turned to an older solution, one that didn't require cold, only time and salt. Salt-preserved pork was a cornerstone of wartime preservation. Long before refrigeration became standard, entire communities relied on this method to store meat through months of heat, transport delays, and supply cuts. World War II didn't invent the technique, but it forced a generation to bring it back. The process was simple but slow. Fresh pork was cleaned, trimmed, and packed in coarse salt, layer by layer, inside stone crocks or wooden barrels. Every crevice was filled. No air allowed. The salt drew out moisture. hardened the flesh, and created an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. After days or weeks, depending on thickness, the meat was ready for storage. Hung in dry cellars, wrapped in cloth, sometimes smoked for extra durability. It didn't need a fridge. It needed vigilance and discipline. During the war, pork was rationed strictly, so families preserved even small cuts, belly strips, shoulder pieces, trimmings. Nothing was wasted. This meat could last months, sometimes over a year, if stored properly. Before use, it had to be soaked to remove excess salt, often boiled twice. Some fried it crisp and served with boiled potatoes. Others diced it into stews where rationed vegetables stretched its flavor. Salted pork wasn't a daily meal. It was a backup. A protein reserve for when rations failed, shops were bombed, or delivery lines were cut. But its storage didn't come without risks. If the salt was too light or air crept in, spoilage followed. Mold, rot, or worse. That's why civilians followed strict rules. Keep it dry, keep it dark, check it weekly. Children were taught to recognize the signs. Discoloration, odor, slippery surface. One spoiled cut could ruin an entire barrel. Still, for thousands, it worked. In occupied towns where fridges were looted or power never returned, salt-cured pork kept families from starving. It taught them that preservation didn't require electricity, only knowledge. Today, we refrigerate out of habit, freeze without thinking. But systems fail. And when they do, the only meat that lasts is the kind prepared to live outside the grid. Would you know how to pack it before the next blackout? Or would you watch fresh food rot in silence? Subscribe and bring back the preservation your ancestors never abandoned. Number 3. Powdered eggs. When fresh eggs disappeared from markets and chickens were seized for military supply chains, civilians faced a quiet crisis. Missing protein. Eggs weren't just breakfast. They were structure. They held cakes together, thickened sauces, fortified breads. Without them, entire meals collapsed. Enter powdered eggs. Dry, shelf-stable, and engineered for endurance. Issued by governments in tins, these were real eggs, cracked, beaten, dehydrated, and sealed into fine yellow powder. No preservatives, no refrigeration, just heat and air removal. Each tin came with strict instructions. 1 tablespoon of powder plus 2 tablespoons of water equaled 1 egg. It could be scrambled, baked, or stirred into dough, a near-complete replacement when fresh options were gone. For many, the first taste was strange. The texture wasn't perfect, the smell was faintly sulfuric, but when ration points ran low and markets stood empty, powdered eggs filled the gap with quiet reliability. Tins were tightly sealed, often double-lined with wax or tin foil to prevent moisture. Stored in dark cupboards or under stairs, they lasted over a year unopened, sometimes longer if kept cool and dry. Civilians used them sparingly. 1 tin could stretch weeks if portioned carefully. Used only when real eggs couldn't be bartered or borrowed. Some mixed powdered eggs with mashed potato to mimic volume. Others combined them with powdered milk for a richer texture in puddings and pies. But powdered eggs had limitations. Once opened, exposure to air began slow degradation. Humidity ruined the powder, and if insects got in, the supply was gone. That's why families transferred the powder to airtight jars or small canisters, opening only what they needed. Still, the value was undeniable. Powdered eggs brought back recipes once abandoned. They turned ration cakes into real celebration foods. And, in the worst of shortages, they meant a child still got protein for the day. Today, they've vanished from most shelves, replaced by plastic cartons and convenience. But they still exist, quietly stocked by those who remember what disappearance looks like. Because when the cold chain breaks and livestock isn't yours to keep, the only egg that survives is the one prepared to outlast it all. Would you store a tin today, or wait until your last real egg spoils? Subscribe and relearn the rations that sustained a war. Number 4. Dried split peas. In a world stripped of luxury, survival came down to calories per gram. And few wartime foods delivered more for less than dried split peas. They didn't spoil. They didn't need refrigeration. They didn't even need much storage space. Just a cloth sack, a cool corner, and patience. Split peas, green or yellow, were a staple in every ration-conscious home. Packed with protein, fiber, and slow-burning energy, they formed the base of soups, stews, mash, and even improvised loaves. Most families bought them by the kilo when they could. Others received government-issued bags marked with bold block lettering for civilian use. They were hard, dry, and unforgiving straight from the sack. But once soaked overnight and simmered, they transformed into a thick, sustaining meal that kept hunger at bay for hours. One pot could feed 5. 2 cups stretched with water, onion peel, and leftover dripping from preserved meats could last the day. In neighborhoods struck by ration delays or market shortages, pea soup was often the only thing between a family and empty plates. They didn't require spice, they didn't need flavoring, just heat and time. But that simplicity was also their strength. Unlike canned goods, they never rusted or burst. Unlike flour, they weren't easily infested. And unlike fresh produce, they stored clean for years in dry conditions. Every cupboard had a sack of them, tucked in the back. Insurance against the unexpected. In colder regions, dried peas were even ground into flour and mixed with root vegetables to form dumplings or thick cakes. Some added nettle for vitamins, others blended with barley to bulk up the texture. But the benefits weren't without limitations. If water was scarce, split peas became a burden. They demanded soaking and fuel for boiling. And if improperly stored, moisture could turn a sack into mold-ridden waste. Still, compared to most foods, their shelf life was unmatched. Properly kept, they could last up to 5 years. More in dry cellars. Today, dried peas are dismissed as old-fashioned, cheap, bland, forgotten. But they once fed millions through blackout winters, shattered infrastructure, and state collapse. And they did it quietly, without labels or noise. Just stored strength, waiting to be used. Because real survival doesn't come in flashy packaging. It comes in silence, and sustains when nothing else will. Would you store a sack now, or search for one when it's too late? Number 5. Treacle and Blackstrap molasses. In wartime kitchens stripped of sugar, sweetness didn't vanish. It changed form. Civilians turned to treacle and blackstrap molasses. Thick, dark, heavy. These were byproducts of the sugar refining process, once considered inferior. But in WWII, they became essential. Stored in glass jars or metal tins, both substances were shelf-stable for years. No refrigeration, no preservatives, just time-hardened syrup waiting to be used. Treacle, slightly lighter with a hint of bitterness, was common in British homes. Blackstrap molasses, darker and denser, appeared in Allied supply chains where sugar was scarce. Both were rich in minerals, iron, calcium, magnesium, nutrients often missing from restricted diets. Civilians used them in baking when white sugar ran out. Added to bread dough, they gave color and bulk. Mixed into oats, they replaced jam. Drizzled over barley mash, they turned bland meals into something vaguely comforting. Mothers stirred it into hot water to make sweet tea. Others combined it with vinegar and mustard to glaze preserved meats. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about energy. A tablespoon of molasses carried quick calories, essential during long winters and ration shortfalls. Children were given daily spoonfuls as makeshift supplements. In some homes, it was even used to bind crushed vitamin tablets into swallowable paste. But storing it had its rules. Molasses thickened in the cold, it crystallized over time. So civilians kept it in dark cupboards, warming the jars before use by placing them near stoves or under blankets. A jar could last months or more if handled carefully. Spoilage was rare, but if water got in, fermentation began. That's why lids were sealed tight and jars opened with clean, dry spoons only. Despite its bitterness, the value was unmatched. It was cheap, unlikely to be looted, and impossible to fake. Today, most wouldn't recognize Blackstrap molasses in a store aisle. Yet once it was a daily necessity, not just for survival, but for maintaining strength when other options disappeared. Because in times of collapse, sweetness doesn't come from luxury. It comes from what lingers longest on the shelf. Would you stock it today, or learn its worth only when sugar's gone? Number 6. Canned dripping, rendered fat. When cooking oil vanished and butter became a memory, civilians turned to what meat left behind? Fat. Rendered animal fat, known simply as dripping, became one of the most valuable cooking resources of WWII. It wasn't refined, it wasn't elegant, but it lasted. Dripping was made by slowly cooking meat trimmings, skins, or fatty cuts until the fat liquefied. This liquid was strained, cooled, and stored in metal tins or ceramic crocks. Once solidified, it formed a pale block, dense, greasy, and shelf-stable. No refrigeration required. Properly rendered and stored, it resisted spoilage for months, sometimes over a year in cool conditions. It was sealed with a layer of its own fat to keep air and bacteria out. Sometimes ash or salt was sprinkled on top for extra preservation. Civilians used it for nearly everything. They fried potatoes in it when oil was gone. They spread it on bread as a butter substitute. Mixed into pastry, it gave crusts their flakiness. Even a spoonful added to thin soup gave it richness that rationed ingredients couldn't deliver alone. In poor households, it became the base of entire meals. Dripping was scraped from roasting pans after every meal. Even the smallest amount was collected, nothing wasted. It was poured into small cans, covered and stacked in pantries. But dripping was more than food. It was strategy. It allowed families to stretch meat across multiple meals. First the roast, then the dripping, then the hardened fat, melted down again to fry rationed onions or dried peas. Every use was calculated, and every storage method mattered. If water entered the fat, mold followed. If containers were left unsealed, rodents found them. That's why civilians used jars with tight lids or reused lard tins from before the war. Children were taught how to render safely. Melt low, strain carefully, cool before sealing. It wasn't just cooking, it was conservation. Still, dripping had limits. It couldn't replace vitamins. Consumed in excess, it caused digestion issues. But in calorie-starved winters, none of that mattered. Because in the cold, fat meant warmth. And in scarcity, fat meant fuel. Not for machines, but for the human body. Today, rendered fat is thrown out, ignored, or replaced with branded oils. But once, it was survival in a can. Because when supply chains break and the labels disappear, what's left is what you made yourself, quietly, without waste. Would you know how to store it before it spoils, or will you scrape the pan too late? Number 7. Apple leather. When fresh fruit became rare and jams required sugar, civilians couldn't spare. Families turned to preservation by evaporation. Apple leather, or fruit sheets, was one of the simplest, most durable methods for saving nutrition without refrigeration. No jars, no sugar, just heat, patience, and air. The process began with foraged or rationed apples. Bruised, misshapen, or wind-fallen, no fruit was wasted. Civilians peeled and cored them, then stewed the pulp down into thick, smooth puree using the bare minimum of water. No sweeteners, no additives, just fruit. This puree was then spread thin onto cloth, parchment, or baking trays, often repurposed from bombed-out kitchens. Left to dry in sunlit windows, near stoves, or inside unheated attics, the moisture slowly evaporated. After days, what remained was a leathery sheet, dark, flexible, and intensely flavored. It didn't need jars or refrigeration. Once rolled and stored in wax paper or cloth, it lasted for months, sometimes through the next harvest. Apple leather was easy to carry, lightweight, and resistant to spoilage. Children took it in evacuation bags. Fighters tucked it into uniform pockets. It was used as ration supplements, lunch fillers, or quiet treats in times of chaos. Unlike canned fruit, it didn't risk spoilage from temperature swings or broken seals. It didn't need tin openers, and it didn't require refrigeration to stay edible. But making it took time. Weather mattered. Too much humidity, and it molded. Too little sun, and it never dried fully. That's why families made it in bulk during dry spells, rotating trays and cloths to ensure even drying. Some added crushed berries, carrot pulp, or beet juice to stretch the mix. Others flavored it with lemon peel or leftover tea leaves. But the goal was always the same: preserve nutrition without dependency. Today, fruit leather is a novelty snack, prepackaged and sweetened beyond recognition. But in World War II, it was medicine. It provided fiber, calories, and a reminder of sweetness in bitter months. Because when the sugar is gone and jars are too fragile, the oldest form of preservation still holds its place. Would you know how to make it with nothing but heat and cloth? Or will fruit rot in your hands while you wait for power? Number 8. Vacuum-sealed cheese, hard varieties. When milk became scarce and refrigeration unreliable, cheese wasn't abandoned, it was transformed. Hard cheeses, especially cheddar and similar aged varieties, became one of the few dairy options that didn't rely on cold. But survival demanded more than aging. It demanded protection. Enter vacuum sealing and wax coating. Two simple methods that turned a perishable product into a long-term food supply. During WWII, civilians and small dairies learned to extend the life of cheese without electricity. Cheese wheels were dried, brushed clean, then coated in layers of paraffin wax or wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Others were vacuum-packed, using hand-operated pumps or improvised sealing systems. The goal was simple: block air, halt mold, and trap moisture inside. Once sealed, these cheeses could be stored for months, sometimes over a year, without refrigeration. Kept in cellars, cupboards, or crates buried underground, they hardened slowly, becoming more intense in flavor, but still edible. Unlike soft cheeses, these blocks didn't collapse. They withstood heat, humidity, and disruption. Sliced thinly, a small piece provided calories, protein, and fat, all essential in a ration-starved world. Grated into soups, melted over dried bread, or eaten in slivers alongside preserved meats, it became the only dairy many civilians would taste for weeks. But preservation came with caution. If the seal broke, mold spread fast. If moisture got in, rot followed. That's why families regularly inspected waxed blocks for cracks, re-dipping or resealing when needed. In some towns, cheese was bartered like currency. A vacuum-sealed block traded for grain, soap, or fuel. Its value came not from flavor, but from reliability. And unlike powdered milk or canned dairy, cheese needed no processing, no boiling, no mixing, just cutting and care. The skill to seal and store became part of the household rhythm. Children learned to brush molds off rinds, slice without waste, and rotate stock based on hardness and age. Today, refrigeration masks fragility. We expect freshness on demand. But when the power fails and the cooler's warm, only the foods sealed for silence survive. Hard cheese didn't just outlast milk, it outlasted collapse. Because in times of war, the best food isn't the most convenient, It's the most prepared. Would your kitchen hold any dairy after the grid fails? Or will you watch perishables fade while sealed cheese stays firm? They didn't have deep freezers. They didn't have emergency food kits, survival blogs, or prepackaged backups. What they had was knowledge and a quiet discipline that modern life has erased. WWII civilians didn't survive because they stockpiled. They survived because they knew how to extend the life of what little they had. They dried apples on cloth instead of wrapping them in plastic. They salted pork in barrels instead of relying on electricity. They canned fat, sealed cheese, and stored hardtack under beds. Not because it was trendy, but because failure wasn't an option. Their food didn't need power. It needed patience. And in a world collapsing inch by inch, that patience outlasted systems, sieges, and storms. We've forgotten that kind of thinking. Today, we throw food out at the first sign of browning. We rely on fridges that fail after hours. We eat for flavor, not survival. But the truth is simple. The next breakdown won't come with warning. And when the trucks stop, when the shelves empty, when the light flickers and doesn't return, your survival won't depend on luck. It will depend on what you remembered. These 8 foods weren't chosen for taste. They were chosen because they worked through war, blackout, and famine. Not for a week, not for a month, for years. And still, most people don't know a single one. That's why this isn't just content. This is recovery. You're not just learning history. You're rebuilding a forgotten playbook, one meal at a time. Because every shelf you stock without electricity, every recipe you revive without a plug, every method you learn without a machine is one step further from collapse. So if you're here, still listening, ask yourself, would you rather trust the grid or trust the knowledge buried beneath dust and silence? Subscribe now. Not because it's easy, but because next time you might not get a second chance. This is the survival your grandparents never had to name. They just lived it. Now it's your turn to remember.